50% of all women will leave the tech labor force in the first 10 years because of a hostile work environment.
This is the Angel Next Door podcast, where we will talk about all things angel investing. What it is, who does it, how do we find them, what does it mean to invest in an early stage company? If you have ever wondered how you can affect the change you want to see in the world, then tune in to learn more. In this episode, I'm joined by Katica Roy, a gender economist and the CEO of Pipeline, an award-winning SaaS company that uses artificial intelligence to uncover and drive financial gains through gender equity. We dig into the hidden costs of biased algorithms and explore practical steps we can all take to demand equity in our workplaces and in the technology that shapes our lives. Here's a thought experiment. What would ChatGPT tell you if you asked the same question as the opposite gender? The answers can be eye-opening and a reminder of why this conversation matters. AI is still in its early days, which means we have a critical window to shape it with equity at the center. It's not too late. Enjoy the show. Well, Katica, thank you so much for coming to the show and being here with me on the Angel Next Door podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I am super excited to talk to you. I don't think I've ever spoken to a gender economist before, so I'm really excited. And people who know me and know the show know that we talk a lot about the inequities in funding for women and amongst lots of other things. But I'm super interested to talk to you, especially since you've written articles, you've been on the cover of New York Times, talking about this very issue of gender inequality. So start off, tell me a little bit about your background and how you became a gender economist.
Probably the thing that impacted my work the most is my parents' story. So I'll try to say quickly, I am the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My mom was born on the Isle of Guernsey in 1939, the year that World War II began. And in 1940, when France fell to the German army, Prime Minister Churchill doubted his ability to defend the Channel Isles. And so he evacuated 5,000 children. My mom was one of those children, actually on the last ship off of Guernsey, placed into an orphanage. And she was actually separated from her mother and her 4 older siblings. She was adopted a year later, and she actually would never see her own mom again. And she emigrated to the United States when she was 21 for equity and opportunity. So that's my mom. My father escaped from Hungary after the fall of the 1956 revolution. And he escaped not only with himself, but also he risked my 3 eldest sisters. So they were 3, 7, and 8 at the time. And with the help of Hungarian freedom fighters, they walked across a minefield and arrived at a refugee camp in Austria. Less than 2 months into their stay in the refugee camp, President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the United States on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. So for me, the work that I do is very much about the fact that one person in a position of power stood up and said, not on my watch, this will not happen, these people matter. And that changed the trajectory of my life. And so that's why I do the work that I do, to make a difference in other people's lives.
Wow, that's an incredible story. We'll definitely put the link to your story reel on YouTube. I was watching it right before we came on. It's so good.
Thank you. And what's funny is you mentioned in the intro that I was on the cover of the New York Times. The night before, because obviously I knew that was coming before it was actually on the front page, I realized that the arrival of my family was also on the front page of the New York Times on December 26, 1956. And President Eisenhower's presidential library had sent me everything associated. It was called Operation Safe Haven, and sent me all the historical artifacts. And so I was talking with my daughter, and it was like 2 generations over 68 years apart on the front page of the New York Times. So the front page of the New York Times was amazing anyway, but it was also incredible because of the significance for my family.
That is a really cool story. So then what prompted you to become a gender economist? Because if I remember right from the video, that wasn't your initial career.
Yeah, well, I think we all had to, right? I've been in the working world for 30 years. So I have 3 degrees. So I obviously am a trained economist, but I'm also a trained full stack software engineer. And I am also a breadwinner mom who fought to be paid equitably twice and won. I was in undergrad, I was exposed to women's rights. When I went into the workplace, I thought, well, I don't know if that really applies anymore. Then fast forward, when I was on maternity leave with my daughter, my boss was optimized, which is a fancy word for fired. The day after I got back from maternity leave, I actually had a team that I was managing. At that point, I was a breadwinner mom for a family of 4. The day after I came back, they asked me to take on an additional team. And then 2 weeks later, they asked me to take on a 3rd team. So I was like, this is great, right? Breadwinner mom for a family of 4. This is a great opportunity. And yet my male colleague took on 1 additional team. He was 1 pay grade higher than I was and received additional compensation for that team. And I received nothing. And so when I went to talk to my new manager in HR about how do you want to make me whole in my compensation? This is a great opportunity. I'm happy to contribute to the team. It was crickets for 2 months. My very first job out of college, before I got my master's degrees, was actually as a litigation paralegal. And I thought, well, there's going to be something that makes this illegal. And I had the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which basically changed the statute of limitations to from when the pay decision is made to every time you are paid inequitably, the clock starts over. And so I call it huge change because you might not know and you might not find out. And if you don't, and that was the whole point. If you don't find out for years, then how can you rectify that, right? So I just called HR and said, this is a Lilly Ledbetter issue. What do you want to do about it? Now, to their credit, they increased my level, increased my back pay, and increased my pay. But what really concerned me was the idea that I was a top performer. I'd been promoted 7 times in 8 years. Why did I have to do research in order to be treated equitably? And I think that really was my catalyst into ultimately doing what I do now.
Wow, that's great. So we've talked actually on the podcast before about algorithms and biases. And so I'm super interested to hear your take on this. The article was great. We'll put the link in the show notes. So tell us a little bit more about what prompted you to write the article and kind of all the backstory behind it.
Well, it's a few things. It's a huge topic right now, especially with the release of generative AI a few years ago. And I think even though artificial intelligence was a huge part of our system before, that release of consumer-based generative artificial intelligence, I think people really understood the power of it, and it's made a big difference. And so it's gotten a lot more conversation. And as someone who started a tech company that actually created not only neutral AI, but actually equitable AI, I knew that this could be fixed and that it wasn't just the right thing to do, but it was actually an economic opportunity. And that perhaps I was the person to talk about how exactly to do that and why you should care about it beyond just the right thing to do, but actually it's a massive economic opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about the algorithms, just what has happened over time. How did we get here?
So that's a great question. So the thing about artificial intelligence, and I think maybe some people are more familiar with this now, but there's really, if you boil it down, there's 2 components. There's the data component, right? So the data you use to feed into the algorithms to train the algorithms. And then there's the algorithms themselves. And so when we talk about bias in AI, it's both of those things. One is the data that we're actually feeding into the artificial intelligence. And if we don't recognize that data could have bias and control for it, then what happens is once it goes into the algorithms, then it will essentially hardwire bias into our systems. And we've seen some of that talked about more recently there's been talk about how ChatGPT was coaching women to ask for lower salaries. There was that conversation. If you back up, that predates the sort of consumer base of generative AI. We had the Amazon hiring app. We also have seen this, for instance, in home loans or in credit cards. So the Apple card originally that was backed by Goldman, everything else being the same, right? So same income, same assets, same credit score, et cetera. If you were a woman, you got a lower credit limit than if you were a man. And that is basically artificial intelligence replicating bias at scale. And then I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the bigger issue is then what happens with livelihoods, right? When you hardwire, what happens if you're on LinkedIn and the algorithm downgrade your posts because you're a woman or you're talking about women or you're talking about equity or whatever that is? If that is unsupervised, it's not only just an inconvenience, you're talking about directly impacting, you talked about female entrepreneurs, their ability to advertise their products, their ability to build their companies at scale, their ability to make a return for their investors. And then, of course, if those investors are VCs and they have LPs, then you're talking about that. And if you look at LPs, that almost impacts anyone depending on the fund, because there are a lot of retirement and pension funds that are actually LPs. So you might not even know that you are an LP in a fund. So it really does impact that chain.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that if it's not controlled for, like, how can you even control for that?
You can control for it in 2 ways. One is understanding the bias that's in the data. By the way, for anyone who's artificial, that's so simple. Yes, because we're trying to make it simple so people can understand. One is understanding the bias that already exists in the data so that you can find it and correct for it. And then the second is ensuring that your algorithms are supervised so that they are not essentially hardwiring that bias into the decisions that they're making. I understand that's simplified, but I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible for folks.
Yeah, we've had Colette Corian, who is the CEO of Joylux, on before. She's a women's health company, and it's for pelvic floor issues. And it was basically the algorithms looked at it as if it was something that was pornographic. So many issues. Amazon's store got shut down. They weren't allowed to run Facebook ads, all of these things. How can we help that to not be the case anymore?
What are the solutions? Well, there are action steps that we can take. And I would say also it's not too late. One of the things we know that if we actually are committed to this, for instance, like the EU has done a very good job, and I will answer your question with specific steps, but just to frame it for people. In the United States, we have not done a good job in terms of how we architect oversight for technology in general, but in particular for artificial intelligence. The European Union has done a much better job. What's interesting about it is two things. We know from the research that if we were really committed to working to eliminate bias, artificial intelligence, we could probably scale that within 5 to 10 years. It is not that far away. And what's also really interesting, if we just talk about the labor market, and then again, I will get to your specific question, but if we talk about the labor market, I was on the front page of the New York Times talking about this lopsided impact on Black women in the labor force, both in terms of exiting, or not exiting, but being pushed out of the labor force, the jobs that they've lost, unemployment, et cetera. One of the things that we know is using equitable artificial intelligence. So essentially artificial intelligence that goes through all the people decisions that are made. So hiring, internal hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion, which are the 5 key decisions that employers make. We could actually eliminate bias in the workplace in 10 years.
Wow.
It is totally within our reach. The issue is political will and commitment to actually doing it. I write for the World Economic Forum, and I have covered other countries who really made these commitments around equity, obviously one of them in the tech labor force and in artificial intelligence, and they've made huge gains in just a few years. But in terms of what we can actually do concretely, in addition to the oversight, regulation, et cetera, one is the training on representative data sets. So ensuring that you really have data sets that are equitable and representative, testing for fairness before deployment. And that is really important. That also speaks to ensuring that there is representation on your tech teams, so that you actually have a lived experience when you are testing, because you may not know a bias that a Black woman experiences, right? Or that a Latina experiences, et cetera. So having that representation and listening to them is very important. Embedding human oversight in teams is important. And really being able to explain and be transparent about what your artificial intelligence does and understanding that so that you essentially get supervised, if you will. And then the last is collaboration. So really ensuring that we are open sourcing, if you will, the bias fixes so we can scale it faster. That's not something we should only, there's a social good aspect of it, right? Yes, it's an economic opportunity, and it's also a social good. When you share that from an open source perspective, the positive economic impact is exponential.
Wow, that's super interesting. So when it comes down to the social and the financial ramifications of all this with something like ChatGPT, how can we work to make that as individual consumers better? Is there anything we can do individually?
Yeah, stand up and speak out. That would be one, right? Like your voice actually has more of an impact than you think it does. I certainly have experienced that. My NBC byline would be just one example of that. But I think standing up and speaking out is one. I think it's very interesting. OpenAI, who obviously is the parent company of ChatGPT, announced this large scaling initiative. I believe they're partnering maybe with Walmart and Accenture. So demanding that's equitable is absolutely something that we can do in terms of ensuring that those skilling efforts are equitable. What I mean by that is there's both equitable access to skilling. So for instance, people get paid to go through those skilling efforts, that there's wraparound. If you are a breadwinner mom, that you have some sort of childcare support, but really ensuring that we are advertising that in a way that might get to folks who might not otherwise have access to that. So that could be through workforce centers or other kind of outreach programs. And then the second part of that is ensuring that once the skilled folks are actually in your company, that they have equitable access to apply those skills. So one of the things that we know is women overall, and so from a gender plus race, ethnicity, and age perspective, so intersectionally, 50% of all women will leave the tech labor force in the first 10 years because of a hostile work environment. And so ensuring that they not only have equitable access to the skills, but also going back to that equitable ability to apply those skills. So for instance, when you're doing code reviews, when you're testing before deployment, ensuring that all voices are heard, that we are essentially designing that as equitable by design, not inequitable by default. And artificial intelligence is just really at the beginning of what we're going to see. And so we have a huge opportunity in that skilling piece to ensure equity and to demand it, especially if it's your workforce. If you're an American taxpayer, there is a chunk of money, depends on the year, that actually goes to workforce development. It's typically been like billions of dollars. That's our tax dollars at work, right? You and I pay for that. So we should demand that those are used in an equitable manner, because at the end of the day, that's actually good for everyone. It provides better economic opportunity and outcomes.
So where do you think this AI evolution is going to be in 5 years?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it depends. That's probably not the answer that you want. But I think, so for instance, we know that the AI market itself is projected to be, I think, a little over $1 trillion. That's not the market cap, but that's the straight revenue. A little over $1 trillion by 2032. So it's a huge growing market. And I think the question of where will we be depends on what we do. So we have the opportunity now to demand equity in those artificial intelligence systems. We are not only stakeholders, but we're taxpayers, that we should demand that. And if we do that, then we can actually create a more equitable world in 5 years. Like I said, if we actually committed to ensuring equity and inclusion in artificial intelligence, and essentially committing to ensuring that artificial intelligence is equitable by design, we would be halfway toward that journey, rooting out bias in artificial intelligence. To that now.
So for our listeners out there, what could they do? Should they be writing to their congresspeople, talking about it in their workplace? What would be like an actionable thing if you said, if every single person who's listening would do this, what is the one thing that you'd want them to do?
Yeah, don't write your Congress. We remember Congress. Call them, but it's more effective. Just as somebody who used to be many years ago as an intern on Capitol Hill, it's far more effective to call than to write. I would definitely do that. I would also look at your state and local workforce investment boards and demand to understand how they are using that. There is power in talking about, for instance, the work that OpenAI is doing with Accenture and Walmart and demanding that's equitable. We had already seen the impact. So if you look at Target and the Target Fast and that coordinated effort to make a difference, it made a difference. So there is a blueprint for how to come together to demand that work is equitable.
That's great. And we'll tell all of our listeners, of course, to follow you on social media and to be watching what you're putting out there as well. Where can people find you?
They can find me at katicaroy.com. And I am most active on LinkedIn. And then secondly, most active on Instagram. So that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Well, Katica, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today and sharing this wisdom with us. We will definitely put links to everything you're doing in the show notes. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. To connect with me, visit my website at marciadawood.com. And please subscribe, follow, and leave a review. It helps the podcast get seen by more people. And remember, you can also find the Angel Next Door podcast on YouTube too. And if you're looking to learn more about investing in the changes you want to see in the world, sign up for Ann and Bill Payne's ACA Angel University classes. Go to theangelcapitalassociation.org, all one word, to find out the schedule. And classes are now available on demand. Many classes are offered, everything from angel investing basics, which include fundamentals, risk, due diligence, term sheets, valuations, returns and portfolio strategy, and even a class on group formation. There's even a deeper dive where you can get advanced classes, including capitalization tables, startup boards, and exit strategies. If you're not already a member of the Angel Capital Association, you can become one for a low price that will give you unparalleled access to discounts, free webinars with a huge archive of content, networking opportunities, and much more. We'd love to have you join us. All content for this website is informational and not intended to serve as legal, tax, accounting, or investing advice. While Marcia, that's me, does serve on the SEC Small Business Capital Formation Advisory Committee, my views are my own and not the views of the SEC or my fellow colleagues on the committee. Our speakers and hosts are thoughtfully selected for their educational value, but their opinions are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the host, me, or the Angel Capital Association, and neither specifically endorse the use of presenters' products or services. Listeners of the podcast should consult their own tax, investing, legal, or accounting advisors before making important financial decisions. All warranties, including accuracy, completeness, and suitability for specific purpose, are disclaimed.